Hi and welcome. I'm Vicki Shaw with Clinical Liver Disease Journal, and today I have Dr. W.M.L. He comes from UT Southwestern in Dallas, Texas. We're going to be discussing his article on the history of acetaminophen toxicity. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for joining us. We appreciate it. So can we just go over the basic history of acetaminophen?
Right. Well, the compound was discovered in the 1890s, but it first came into use in the UK in the 1960s. And over there, in most of Europe, they call it paracetamol. They don't call it acetaminophen, but basically it's the exact same thing. And I was actually a liver fellow at King's in 1973, and there were always two patients in the liver ICU that they'd put up there in the very early 70s. Young women in coma on a ventilator from acetaminophen paracetamol overdoses. It was very popular pain medicine, but also used for suicidal overdoses, mainly by young people having romantic issues. So I was aware of it, got back to the U.S. in the 70s, and we started reporting, not myself, but many others in the U.S., what we called later unintentional cases, but which are really people who are not trying to commit suicide, not taking it at a single point in time, but taking excess doses over several days because of pain issues. So that is what Dr. Zimmerman initially called the therapeutic misadventure. It was sometimes called the alcohol Tylenol syndrome. But anyhow, we in a sense, over the 80s, began to talk about acetaminophen overdoses in the U.S. And by the 90s, this had come to across the Atlantic to America, initially sort of unrecognized. And we still don't have as many suicidal cases as they seem to in the UK and in Northern Europe. And initially, they didn't recognize any cases in Europe as being unintentional. Now they do, and they call them something else. They call them staggered overdoses. So it's been an interesting journey. But acetaminophen overdoses make up at least 46% of all acute liver failure, which dwarfs every other cause of acute liver failure. Drug-induced liver injury, prescription drugs, is only about 10 or 11%.
So how were the pathways discovered, and
So
how has it helped
interestingly, back to the 70s, there was a group in pharmacology at the NIH that were not interested at all in acetaminophen, didn't even know about it, but we're looking at bromobenzene, another compound that damages hepatocytes. And they were interested in whether damaging hepatocytes led to carcinogenesis, led to cancers. And they stumbled on acetaminophen just by chance and found that it did, in fact, do damage to rat livers. But there was an interesting point that when they went to repeat it the following day and days after that, they couldn't make it happen until they realized they had to be starving. So you had to have the quantity of the drug, but you also had to have starved the animals overnight. You couldn't feed them. And it turns out that rodents eat a lot at night, so they're always have a full stomach in the morning.
Yeah.
Anyhow, they had heard about the cases in the UK, and they suddenly put together that they had this animal model for toxicity and recognized that it was dose-related, which of course it is. It's not an idiosyncratic reaction. It's always dose-related. All mammalian species will have toxicity based on incremental dosing. So the first steps were to figure out what the active intermediate was, and then they figured out that it bound to cell proteins via cysteine. And then finally, they discovered that in liver tissue and also in plasma, you can find what we call acetaminophen cis adducts, the acetaminophen highly reactive intermediate that's bound to cell proteins. The important part about that is that led to discovering that if you supplied a sulfhydryl donor, either glutathione or cysteine, which makes glutathione, and we now use N-acetylcysteine as the antidote. So discovering the pathway in the 70s led to discovering the antidote very shortly thereafter. And of course, we use N-acetylcysteine all the time now.
So what's the current status of acetaminophen with acute liver failure?
So again, as I said, about 46% of all acute liver failure is related to acetaminophen. Roughly half are suicide, intentional single time point overdoses, and half are these so-called unintentional cases. Fortunately, the outcomes are fairly good. 2/3 or nearly 2/3 will recover rather rapidly. The injury is very brief, it's very severe, but it gets better very quickly, unlike idiosyncratic reactions that drag on for week after week. So if by day 4 after your presentation to hospital, you're either dead, transplanted, only 8% transplanted, or about 65% will have survived.
Yeah.
So there still are people that do die of this, and it's tragic when they do, because they're often young people that were healthy 5 days ago.
Yeah, it's very hard in
Yeah.
practice. Thank you so much for joining us. We really
Thank you.
appreciate having you. If you'd like to learn more, please go to cldlearning.com. Thank you.